High-ranking members of the political elite surround the body of Lenti Beria, the head of the secret police, who has just been executed for his numerous crimes against the Soviet people in Armando Iannucci's The Death of Stalin. Malenkov, the interim leader, reluctantly accepts the decision. As the new leader, Khrushchev turns to Kaganovich and poses a question that leaves a lasting impression. Can you trust a weak man? With reference to Malenkov, and Kaganovich responds without hesitation. Have you ever put your trust in a weak person? This question forces us to consider the true meaning of trust and, more significantly, how our relationship with power and the trust of those around us can be significantly impacted by our vulnerability. We believe that weakness is neutral and that both strong people who don't always act morally and weak people who are good-hearted exist. However, the film offers us an other viewpoint, portraying frailty as something confining and nearly incapable of fostering trust. And when you give it some thought, you realize that weakness can actually hold us back and keep us from progressing in many circumstances. I chose to bring up this subject because we will be confronting the reality of weakness today and learning why it so deeply troubled the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche believed that weakness was not a quality that could be disregarded or viewed as neutral. A harmful aspect of weakness, in his opinion, was the incapacity to be truthful with both himself and the outside world. And this is when we start to understand his reflections. We'll look at strength and weakness from a different angle, which may alter how you view your own decisions and even your relationships. We'll look at why Nietzsche believed that weakness and unhappiness go hand in hand, why strength is the only thing that can truly be good, and why honesty is the key to it all. Keep in mind that this is only a portion of Nietzsche's thoughts on weakness. What I offer here are elements that can help you think more deeply and that make sense in the circumstances we are in right now. And it all begins with Nietzsche's basic idea that weakness is really a kind of dishonesty. Let's examine another narrative as an example, this one having a darker tone. A young woman named Nastenka is the object of the protagonist's intense love in one of Dostoevsky's short stories. They discuss about life together for a few of evenings. She lets it all out and admits that she is in love with someone else which she feels has left her. Nastenka appears to like our protagonist over time, even going so far as to think about staying with him. However, the protagonist is left alone and devastated when Nastenka's former lover reappears at the last second, and she rushes to him. His attempts to persuade himself that he is content with the circumstances are what make this predicament intriguing. At least she's happy now, he assures himself. On the inside, however, there is still unresolved grief and need. This tale exemplifies Nietzsche's definition of weakness and the associated dishonesty. It's about not being able to be honest with one's feelings, even when it hurts, rather than being weak or insecure. Several of Nietzsche's writings are infused with his perception of dishonesty and weakness, particularly Beyond Good and Evil and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. According to him, allowing circumstances and unmet wishes to rule one's life and being unable to act in accordance with one's own will constitutes true weakness. The question that arises from this is how often we act as though everything is okay, while deep inside we want to express our feelings to the world. More importantly, how can we learn to be strong, honest, and true to ourselves in order to overcome this weakness that prevents us from moving forward? It is important to note that Nietzsche discusses weakness in a variety of ways depending on the situation, and this is one of the most prevalent, the weakness of people who have an objective but are unable to accomplish it for various reasons. This is the situation with people like Napoleon, who failed to establish the magnificent empire he desired in spite of his strength and willpower. This failure to accomplish a goal is not in and of itself a problem in Nietzsche's view. He finds it particularly upsetting when this vulnerability results in self-deception. The protagonist of Dostoevsky's White Nights serves as an illustration of this. He makes an effort to persuade himself that he's okay with the circumstances at the end of the story, but he's not. According to Nietzsche, this conduct is a more profound kind of weakness that he abhors. The narrator chooses to lie to himself and escape into a fiction that keeps him from accepting reality rather than confronting it head-on, acknowledging that his desire has been denied, and dealing with it. He simply acts as though he no longer desires Nastenka, rather than making an effort to win her over or looking for a way to grow as a person. According to Nietzsche, this flaw represents the incapacity to subdue and control one's own will. This is merely an attempt to avoid a painful reality. There is no actual progress being made. According to Nietzsche, this weakness has the potential to develop into bitterness and anger at its worst. According to Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, people start to despise their own desires when they are unable to obtain what they truly seek, whether it be independence, love, power, or recognition. They would rather tell themselves that they didn't really want to fail than acknowledge it, transforming something they once valued into something vile. Nietzsche addresses internal weaknesses, or those that bind us from the inside out, in addition to going far beyond external deficiencies and delving into subtler aspects. He lists the guilt-free pursuit of one's own interests, disregarding moral principles, and not always considering the welfare of others as one of these faults. He condemns hedonism for displaying a lack of self-organization rather than for being immoral. Before getting into this issue, it is important to keep in mind that Nietzsche's concept of will is nuanced and hotly contested. Throughout his work, particularly in his posthumous publications, he himself returns to a few points. Nietzsche starts using the word weakness in a completely different meaning in his final works. Weakness is now a much deeper concept that has to do with how one organizes their own will rather than just being a matter of physical or external strength. Nietzsche had a distinct perspective on the will, as though our minds were composed of multiple internal forces that compete to steer us in different directions, while each tugging in a different direction. Although it can appear to be an abstract concept, it perfectly aligns with the realities of our everyday lives. Imagine wanting to brew a cup of tea 1 minute, but then deciding to cook something else instead. You want to go to the store and buy something different to nibble on before making a decision. These seemingly insignificant impulses, each pulling in a different direction, can leave us confused and without a clear direction if they are not arranged logically. Nietzsche mentions the unorganized will at this point. We get paralyzed and unable to take decisive action in the direction we desire when we are unable to focus and organize our desires. This relates to the concept of weakness he previously discussed, as you can see. We end up letting go of our goals and aspirations if we are unable to make consistent decisions and stick with them. Without strong values to guide us, this lack of direction causes us to become nihilistic and stop accomplishing anything worthwhile. King Edward II of England is a fascinating illustration. Despite having all the authority of the king and tremendous physical might, his mentality was unstable and susceptible to influence from court favorites. He was so inconsistent that he ultimately lost his crown and, sadly, his life as a result of it. A powerful monarch who lacked self-control, he was overthrown by his own frailty. The idea of commitment, the act of genuinely devoting to something, is another important idea in Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche explains the last phase of the Übermensch, the Superman, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This stage represents the capacity to establish and adhere to one's own ideals, directing one's behavior in accordance with precepts of one's own choosing. At this stage, the Übermensch forges his own route and steers clear of both the nihilism of dispersion and inaction, where the will is fragmented into so many different directions that it doesn't commit to anything. Nietzsche was discussing how to give our will purpose and direction so that we can live in accordance with our true desires, not only how to get stronger. Nietzsche's notion of weakness and the idea of conquering oneself are closely related. This may appear complex at first, since Nietzsche uses the term in a sophisticated way, but in essence, we are discussing the will's capacity to align itself and go in a single direction. In other words, self-overcoming is the result of the will's ability to exert power on itself. Nietzsche used the concepts of strength and weakness differently than we are accustomed to. Achieving objectives is only one aspect of power. Another is conquering opposition, particularly internal resistance. It's similar to maintaining your resolve and focus, almost like an unbreakable intention. Think of it as an unwavering resolve, an inner power that keeps you concentrated. We can use Malenkov from the movie The Death of Stalin as an example of this. It is implied that he lacks a strong will and changes based on the opinions of people around him. Essentially, he exhibits the frailty Nietzsche would condemn, the incapacity to withstand outside pressures and uphold an authentically own position. The people who have impacted Malenkov the most recently own his will, not him. Of course, this isn't a historical assessment of the real Malenkov, it's just a portrayal in the movie. This type of weakness was hated by Nietzsche. Such behavior is condemned even by the characters in The Death of Stalin. It is impossible to trust people like that, either by themselves or by others. The value of someone's remarks is diminished when they are inconsistent. Byung-Chul Han, a philosopher, contends that trust is necessary to bridge this informational and control divide. Since we can never be certain of what people will do, we rely on trust to place bets that they will fulfill their commitments. In this way, being trustworthy equates to having power because people start to trust you and accept what you say, which Nietzsche believes everyone secretly desires. It was precisely because of this weakness and lack of strength that Malenkov was deemed unfit to head the Soviet Union. The political comedy in the movie seemed to impart a philosophical lesson. Nietzsche also disapproved of this lack of will organization since he thought that nihilism could not be conquered in the absence of a structured will. According to him, what distinguishes humans from other creatures is our ability to accomplish great things that give our existence purpose. One of Nietzsche's fascinating obsessions was his desire for mankind to realize its greatest potential. According to him, this would only be feasible if every aspect of our will went in the same direction. He contends that without a strong will that is in line with our control, it is impossible to live a life that is genuinely meaningful. Although it is a practical issue, this is not the only one. However, there is a deeper philosophical problem here as well. Without this consistency, the people around us are unlikely to trust us, which makes our aims difficult to attain. Without a strong and well-organized will, Nietzsche thought that any hardship or adversity could drive us directly to nihilism and disdain for life. This concept, which is central to Nietzsche's philosophy, helps us understand that weakness is not as innocuous as it frequently appears. Does that sound familiar to you? In addition to making it difficult for others to trust us, a disorganized will makes it impossible for us to trust ourselves. Furthermore, this lack of confidence has the potential to undermine all facets of our existence. In light of this, let's examine one of Nietzsche's most contentious positions, the idea that compassion in people is not as pure as it first appears. This emotion can frequently be really damaging to him. We generally learn to care for others in more vulnerable circumstances from an early age, and compassion is typically the route taken for this. Nevertheless, Nietzsche, in contrast to popular belief, did not advocate for cruelty or the misuse of authority. This attitude, in his opinion, was an indication of insecurity, akin to an adult gloating about defeating a youngster in a tennis match. However, he saw a certain untruth and the possibility of unanticipated ill effects in the employment of compassion as a tool to encourage help, and he was highly skeptical of it. This viewpoint is debatable, as is typical of Nietzsche's theories. Additionally, even if it contains some helpful information, don't feel compelled to agree with everything Nietzsche said. It is not an absolute truth because of that. According to Nietzsche, a major aspect of human psychology is the pursuit of power. According to him, our need for power, whether it is over ourselves or the outside world, influences a variety of actions, including career aspirations, accumulating fortune, self-sacrificing behaviors, and even martyrdom. And he believed that compassion was closely related to this power dynamic, particularly when it was called for. Nietzsche viewed compassion as a form of covert weapon when it came from people with little authority. Rather than taking direct action, these individuals would utilize empathy to solicit assistance from others without necessarily accepting any obligation or debt in exchange. Asking a buddy for assistance or striking an agreement on an equal basis are very different from this. According to Nietzsche, those who beg for sympathy without expecting anything in return wind up coming across as defenseless, almost immature, as if to say, someone needs to do it for me because I am incapable of doing it alone. According to Nietzsche, this is dishonest. Furthermore, he thought that partnerships based on honesty are highly valued in nature. One instance of this is when someone makes fun of stronger people in a joke, then when they receive a similar response, they say something like, "Oh, don't hit me, I'm just a poor sap." Using a fictitious fragility as a shield, this manipulative technique seeks to sway people by appealing to their sympathy. Nietzsche had two fundamental objections against pity. First of all, this method of controlling people without bearing the responsibility for his own demands is dishonest. Furthermore, because he thought that this dynamic did not provide long-term advantages. According to Nietzsche, depending on sympathy to keep oneself afloat could be effective in the short term, but once one understands that they are never truly getting what they want, it eventually causes a sense of devaluation and emptiness. Ultimately, the pursuit of sympathy may even be an attempt to make a challenging circumstance better, but the situation is still unfavorable on the inside. According to Nietzsche, genuine strength and authenticity come from confronting our challenges head-on honestly and responsibly, rather than relying on others to handle them. Let's discuss one of Nietzsche's most potent ideas regarding compassion and generosity. He perceived sympathy as a cover, particularly when it came from a stronger person. When someone was so strong and self-assured that they helped others because they wanted to, and because their cup was overflowing, it was entirely different. Being genuinely sympathetic is a very different thing from trying to control. According to Nietzsche, pity is a trap that weakens the other person and feeds a dependency. It is dishonest, even if it originates from a position of authority. According to him, anything with even a hint of dishonesty is despised by nature itself. Consider an abusive relationship to better understand it. An abusive person may employ deceptive methods to make their relationship reliant on them. The tactic may entail undermining their partner's skills to the extent of persuading them that they would be unable to function without it. The individual eventually comes to believe this since they lack fresh proof to the contrary. Nietzsche likens this kind of control to covert sympathy, the desire to maintain the other person's incarceration while stealing their independence for personal gain. Imagine now that the relationship's victim even confesses to being overburdened by life and requests for assistance. In a healthy relationship, the partner would support the other in finding their own power and gradually regaining their independence. Nietzsche believed that the person who practices pity actually does the exact opposite, as if to say, "I'll assist you, but only because I want to gain more control over you by making you rely on me." Similar to a high-interest loan, this would simply increase submission. This pity mindset should be opposed by the new philosophers who Nietzsche felt would be the true value changers of the future, as he explains in Beyond Good and Evil. Instead, they ought to support each person's desire for power and help them build rather than weaken their strength. One of the lessons Zarathustra imparts to his followers is this. This mindset would be viewed by nature as generosity rather than sympathy. Instead of taking advantage of the weak, these new thinkers commit themselves to assisting people in fortifying their own foundations. Nietzsche used this seemingly little distinction to highlight the difference between an abusive lover and a partner who truly helps explain the relationship between genuine assistance and sympathy. He believed that both individuals who offer pity to maintain control over the other person and those who want pity to obtain some control are weak, which leads to this toxic interaction. According to Nietzsche, those who are truly strong would behave philanthropically and refrain from taking advantage of the circumstance. According to Nietzsche, the ultimate power is the ability to be so self-assured, self-reliant, and self-assured that you don't need to remind yourself that you have it by using it on other people. You are aware of it and are content with it to the extent that you are able to recognize other people's strength and the resulting rivalry. This is the type of energy that genuinely tries to assist from the heart rather than concealing itself behind manipulation. Nietzsche believed that Goethe was the best representation of the Übermensch, a being that was above humanity, yet neither a tyrant nor an army leader. He was a creative genius whose brilliance and talent alone transformed Europe. This illustration aids in dispelling the notion that Nietzsche supported dictatorship. Actually, what he hated was piety masquerading as weakness, the phony assistance that simply serves to exert power. One of the most profound and fascinating origins of Nietzschean philosophy may be found right here: the rejection of a life based on weakness and the pursuit of a genuine affirmation of existence. Have you ever given any thought to how we ought to assess a philosophy of life? Many would respond that we judge it by its veracity. But Nietzsche held a somewhat different opinion. He didn't disagree with the concept of truth, but he thought it was impossible to evaluate ideas that dealt with the worth of life or how to live it. Ultimately, every one of us is trapped with our own unique perspective, and our experience is restricted to what we have personally experienced. We forget that we only have access to our inner world when we talk about how life is on the outside. We are not even able to view life objectively from the outside. Nietzsche disassociated himself from pessimism and its associated ideas because he saw that it was ridiculous to attempt to evaluate life as a whole, apart from the experiences of each individual. Since we are unable to assess life objectively or logically, Nietzsche presents us with an option. We can either accept life and view it as positive, or we can reject it and view it as negative. However, every decision has a catch. While accepting life is a huge challenge, possibly one of the biggest, denying life is a path that leads to self-destruction. Nietzsche presents the intriguing idea of Amor fati, or love of fate at this point. Nietzsche developed this concept to its farthest, drawing inspiration from the Stoics. He sought to comprehend how we might enjoy life despite its most painful and terrible aspects, and this was more than just an intellectual exercise for him. For a large portion of his life, Nietzsche struggled with a severe ailment that kept him immobile. Rather than moaning, he channeled this suffering into inspiration for his thoughts. This pain took on significance, and he felt almost proud to bear it. He was able to accept and even relish suffering in this way. However, he was aware that this love of fate necessitated a very specific kind of strength, not the ability to control others, but the ability to defeat oneself. Strangely, this kind of power made Nietzsche adore people like Jesus. Although he did critique Christianity, he recognized in Jesus a model of self-control, a lack of bitterness, and even a measure of love for fate. Although Jesus was not a victor, Nietzsche believed that his inner strength was enormous. However, he thought that weak-minded individuals may be hazardous since they could hurt society and those around them in addition to themselves. Even if it takes extraordinary bravery to follow this path, Nietzsche's passionate vision of how to embrace and even love life's cruelest aspects in order to improve it never ceases to inspire. One of the major foundations of philosophy, Socrates, is harshly criticized by Nietzsche in The Twilight of the Idols for his views on death and condemnation, particularly in light of the philosopher's treatment of life. Plato portrays Socrates in the Phaedon as saying that a true philosopher is not afraid of dying. For him, passing away would mean being freed from the constraints of the body and the humiliations of life. It was not just Socrates who believed that reason should diminish life. Schopenhauer supported it as well, characterizing life as an almost intolerable burden that must be endured until one achieves serenity in non-existence. Since the antinatalist movement implies that it is not worthwhile to begin a life because of the unavoidable pain it entails, Nietzsche would likely condemn it in a similar manner if he were alive today. Nietzsche believed that such ideas were a sign of weakness, a surrender under the mask of philosophy. Amor fati, the instinctive dedication to life despite its challenges, is the antithesis of this. These ideas encourage intellectual detachment, as if life were something to be avoided, rather than accepting it as it is. But why is this important? According to Nietzsche, when this type of thinking proliferates in a community, it poisons its values and weakens its constituents, causing them to deteriorate. He observed this dynamic primarily in Christianity, specifically in the teachings of St. Paul, who praised self-denial and chastity. Nietzsche disapproved of the notion that life is merely a means of preparing for something more in the hereafter, despite his admiration for Jesus. According to him, this idea diminished the significance of the here and now and urged people to reject earthly existence in favor of hope for the future. According to Nietzsche, we are cut off from what gives us life and strength when we suppress our most primal urges. He believed that this denial robbed us of our essential vitality, that ferocious urge that motivates us to struggle and enjoy life to the fullest. According to Nietzsche, the ideologies developed by those he deemed weak ultimately served to reinforce that weakness. It seemed as though there was a relationship between misery and companionship. People who are emotionally or physically weak have a tendency to force others to adopt this constrained perspective on life. Using morality as a weapon is one approach to propagate this vulnerability, but another is to propagate the notion that life itself is not that precious. What motivates us to appreciate life, though, if we think it is worthless? Why should we look for purpose, struggle for our goals, or even get out of bed each day? According to Nietzsche, a passive nihilism and a persistent sense of unhappiness were caused by those philosophies of weakness that rejected existence. He believed that these concepts were genuine illnesses of the soul and deserved his disdain rather than being accepted doctrines. Nietzsche's broad criticism has some merit, even though I don't entirely agree with him, particularly in his view of Socrates. People are reluctant to be enthusiastic about life or anything that deviates from the status quo. In certain quarters, optimism is regarded with mistrust, and those who maintain a more upbeat demeanor are branded as naive or even stupid. However, this mindset is not limited to the local culture. It is also evident in tiny social groupings. Often, one person's extreme pessimism or cynicism can affect the entire atmosphere, making any display of optimism dangerous, or, at the very least, a source of mockery. Nietzsche was alarmed by this, thinking that gloomy ideologies flourish because some people are unable to maintain their optimism and hence influence others to adopt their dismal attitude on life.